40 silver and the back-tithe with it, said Thorvald the lawman, and he said it the way a man reads out a thing he already knows nobody in the room is going to take. The moot-hall at Hvitsand was full that morning, because the wind was up and there was nowhere else in the district to be warm. 40 men and half again as many women stood shoulder to shoulder along the benches, with the smoke of the long hearth hanging in a flat blue sheet above their heads, and every one of them had come to hear the lots called the way people come to hear a story they already know the end of. There were 3 lots. 16 ells of sailcloth went to a man from the outer shore, and a boat with a sprung strake went to 2 brothers who had been arguing about it since the autumn slaughter. And then Thorvald turned the 3rd stick over in his hand, and the hall got quieter the way a hall does when the thing coming is worth watching. Skarholt, he said, the holding at the head of Skarholt, standing empty 9 winters since Otkel died in it. House, cold house, byre, 1 home field, the fishing in the beck. Roof is off the south side. Sold as it lies, with the back-tithe on it. 40 silver. Somebody at the back laughed, and it was not an unkind laugh, only the laugh of a man who thinks a joke is being made. Thorvald did not laugh. He was a heavy, patient old man who had spoken the law on that water for 30 years and had long since stopped hearing anything he was not being paid to hear. 40 silver, he said again. Anyone. Nobody moved. Nobody was ever going to move. Skarholt was a name people in the Jolfjord used the way they used the names of illnesses. Quickly, and then not again. It sat at the top of a bad valley an hour and a half above the last farm, in the shadow of Skaramar, and Otkel had lived up there alone a long time and died up there alone at the end of it, and since then the men who cut wood in that valley had gone out of their way not to walk past the door. Wolf-haunted, they said, and they said it comfortably, in a warm hall, with the wind outside. Then it goes to the chest, said Thorvald, and the chest can have the tithe as well, and he turned the stick over to put it down. I'll take it. Thyra Haldorsdottir had not planned to say it that way, and afterwards she could never account for how it came out of her, except that her hands had gone cold, and her ears had gone hot at the same time, and she had heard her own voice from a little distance away. The way you hear somebody call your name across water. The hall turned. All of it. It turned the way a field of barley turns when a gust comes over the wall, and she stood in it with her back against the doorpost and her hands full of somebody else's wool. She was 21 that winter. She was not tall. She had a great deal of dark hair, near enough to black, that curled hard and would not stay in anything she tied it with, and a face that had been out in the weather since she was small enough to carry a bucket in both arms, and dark eyes that had a habit of going flat and steady when she was frightened, which people mistook for insolence, and which had cost her more than she could count. She wore a moss-green wool gown that had been her mother's and had been turned twice and let out once, with a braided rope belt and an undyed cloak over it, and her hands were the hands of a woman who had been in a wool room since before light every day of her life. She had exactly nothing. She had less than nothing, and everybody in that hall knew the figure. You'll take it, Thorvald said. I'll take it, she said. Kettle Branson got up off the bench. He was her sister's husband, a wide, red, pleasant man who kept the wool room at Hvitsand and gave a great deal of money to the church, and was, on the whole, well liked. And he got up with the particular hurried kindness of a man heading off an embarrassment in his own household. She has no coin, he said to the hall. Not to her. Thorvald, she has no coin. She hasn't had a coin through her hands in 3 years. And he made a small movement with his palm, tipping it, the way you tip a bowl to show that it is empty. I know what she has, said Thorvald. Then you know. She can't bid. That is not the law, said Thorvald, as it happens. And he set the stick back down on the board and looked at her with the first flicker of interest he had shown all morning. Say it properly, girl, in front of the hall. What are you offering? She had thought about it for 11 days. She had thought about it in the wool room. with her hands in the grease and the smell of it in her hair. And she had thought about it lying awake in the loft over Kettle's storehouse, listening to her sister's household breathing below her. And she had turned it over and over until it wore smooth. And now that it was here, it came out of her plainly. "The tithe's 40 silver, she said. "My father's debt to the chest is 40 silver. I'll take the holding and I'll take the tithe onto my own name, and the chest can strike my father's debt against it, because it's the same chest and the same sum, and it costs the district nothing to move a mark from one stick to another. And then I'll owe it against land, instead of owing it against air." There was a silence of about the length of 3 breaths. Then the hall laughed. Not all of it. It never is all of it. That is one of the things she learned that morning and did not forget. But enough of it, and loudly, and one of the outer shoremen said, clear as a bell over the top of the noise, "She's paying a debt with a debt." And that got the rest. And Thyra stood against the doorpost with her ears roaring and made her face do nothing at all. Her sister Gunvor did not laugh. Gunvor sat very straight on the women's bench with her hands in her lap and looked at the floor in front of her feet with an expression of pure, patient shame, which was worse. "Quiet," said Thorvald, without raising his voice, and got it. He looked at the stick. He looked at her. "It is not unlawful," he said slowly, "and I do not like it. You understand what the tithe is. It is not a kindness that runs out. It falls every autumn whether the roof is on or off. You will owe 4 silver a year and the arrears behind it. And if you cannot pay it in the 3rd year, the holding is void and you go to bond service for the balance." "Do you know what bond service is?" "Yes," said Thyra. "Say it." "It's 6 years of my hands in somebody else's house," she said, "and no wage, and I can't leave, and I can't be asked for." "That is what it is," said Thorvald. "And you are 21, and you have a whole life to be sold off the front of. Girl, there is a good place for you here. Your sister's man will keep you." "He will," said Thyra. "He has. For 3 years." She looked at the smoke going along the roof beams so that she would not have to look at any of the faces. "And I'd like to sleep once, before I die, in a house where nobody can say to me at the table that I'm eating on their goodwill." That did something to the hall she had not intended. It went quiet in a different way. Not the quiet before a laugh, but the flat, guarded quiet of a room full of people who have all said that sentence about somebody, and would rather not have heard it said back. Thorvald picked up his knife and made the cut on the stick. It took him no time at all. That was the thing she thought about later, how the whole of it, the roof and the wolves and the man and the Frostmoon and the rest of her life, went onto a piece of split birch in the time it takes to cut a notch. "Skarholt to Thyra Haldorsdottir," he said, with the tithe on it, and Haldor's debt struck against it in the chest. "Ingemund, mark the stick. Girl, the holding is yours from this hour. God help you." She walked out through the crowd, and nobody touched her, and nobody said anything to her face. And at the door, she got the wool she was carrying handed back into her arms by a woman who did not meet her eye, because the wool was Kettle's, and the day's work was still owed whoever she was. Outside, the light off the water was that hard white winter light that makes everything look like it has been scrubbed. She stood on the step and breathed it. Her hands would not stop shaking. Behind her, through the door, she could hear the hall settling back into itself, the noise going up again, and a man saying something with the word Skarholt in it, and then the laugh. Kettle came out after her. He stood beside her on the step for a while, with his thumbs in his belt, looking at the water, being reasonable. "You've shamed her," he said at last. "You know that. In front of the whole district. I've taken a holding. You've taken a hole in the snow with a tithe on it." He said it without heat, which was his way. Kettle was never cruel in any manner he would have recognized, and that was precisely the difficulty with him. "I've kept you 3 years, and I've never once put a figure to you, have I? There isn't a man in this district would say a word against how you've been treated in my house." "No," said Thyra, "there isn't." "Then what is this?" She found there was no answer that would go into the shape he had made for it. It was all true. He had fed her, housed her, never in 3 years said the figure out loud. It was only that everybody else had, and that he had let them, and that when the men had come, 3 of them over 3 years, with their caps in their hands and their courage up, it was Kettle who took each aside first, out of kindness, to explain about the 40 silver, so that nobody should be led on. And each of them went away, and one of them said, out in the yard where she could hear it through the wall, that he was sorry, but a man cannot marry a stick. "It's a house," she said. "It's my own door. It's Otkel's door, and Otkel's roof, and Otkel's ghost." He shook his head. "You'll be back down before the Frostmoon. I'll leave your place at the table." "Thank you," she said, and meant it and hated it. She went up that afternoon with everything she owned, which went into 1 bundle and a basket, 2 gowns, her mother's soapstone spindle whorl, a knife, a cook-pot with a mended handle, a fire steel, a wooden bowl, a hank of thread, 3 days of meal, a little salt in a horn, and a folded piece of sailcloth given her by a man on the outer shore, who was sorry for her, and did not want to say so. The track up Skarholt took her 2 hours, because the snow had blown into the cut and there was nothing under it she could trust. The beck ran black under a lid of ice and made a sound like somebody talking in the next room. Twice she stopped and looked back down the valley at the fjord lying out flat and pale as a knife blade, and both times she thought quite calmly that she had made a mistake that would take 6 years of her life to pay for, and both times she went on. Skarholt came out of the snow at her all at once, the way houses do when the light is low. It was smaller than she had held it in her head. A long, low, turf-roofed house set into the slope with its back to the mountain, the timber of the gables silvered and split, the door hanging on 1 strap and drifted 1/3 of the way up. Beyond it the cold house, which was stone and older and squatter and had a better roof than the house did. Beyond that a byre with the south side of its roof gone in, ribs of rafter standing up out of the snow, a home field under a smooth blank sheet. No smoke anywhere in the world. She stood in the yard for a long moment. Then she put her bundle down in the snow and said, out loud, to nobody, in a voice that came out much smaller than she meant it to, right? She got the door open with her shoulder on the 4th try, and it came off the last strap, and she had to lean it against the wall. Inside it was dark and dry and smelled of cold stone and old smoke, and something faintly, sweetly rotten that turned out to be the remains of a fleece. The hearth was a ring of blackened stones with 9 winters of soot fallen into it. Along one wall was the low sleeping bench, and on it, still, an iron pot and a wooden cup set out, as if for a man coming in, which was the worst thing in the house, and which she dealt with by putting both of them outside the door and not looking at them again. She swept. There was nothing else to do that would keep her hands from shaking. So she cut a birch twig broom and swept the whole floor in the dark until her arms ached, and then she got the fire steel out and got a little fire going in the ring of stones, and when the flame took hold and lifted, the roof timbers came up out of the black above her, and she sat back on her heels and looked up at her own beams and cried for about the length of time it takes to boil a pot, and then stopped and put the pot on. It was in the cold house, the next morning, that she heard it. She had gone across the yard at first light to see what she had. The cold house was stone-built and roofed with turf on split poles, half sunk into the slope, and it was the only building on the holding that Otkel had kept up, which told her something about Otkel. Inside there was a stone bench, a rack, 2 barrels with their heads gone, and a floor of laid flags with straw and old fleece over it, and the smell of it was not the smell she expected. It was warm. Not warm like a fire. Warm like a byre with something living in it. that low animal warmth that a room holds when a body has been in it. And under the cold there was a sharp, musky closeness that lifted every hair on her arms. She stood absolutely still in the doorway with the light coming past her, and she heard it, a small, dry scrape under the flags. And then a sound she knew and could not place for the space of 2 heartbeats, and then placed, and went cold all the way down. It was a whine, the high, thin, broken-off whine of something young that has been keeping quiet for a long time and has stopped being able to. Thyra Haldorsdottir stood in the door of her own cold house on the first morning she had ever owned anything, and looked down at the flagstones, and understood 2 things at once. The first was that the men in the moot-hall who said Skarholt was wolf-haunted had not been telling a story after all. And the second was that whatever was under her floor had heard her moving about up here since yesterday afternoon, and had said nothing, and had not run, because it could not. It took her the better part of an hour to lift the flagstone, with a rafter end for a lever and her heart going like a bird in a fist, and when it came up she did not look straight away. She stood with the stone on its edge and the black slot open at her feet and made herself count to 20. Because if there was a full-grown wolf down there, she wanted it to have the chance to be somewhere else first. Nothing came out. She got down on her knees and put her face to the gap, and the smell came up warm at her, and she waited for her eyes. There was a hollow under the cold house floor, the size of a small boat, dry as a bone, floored with the fine gray dust of a place that has never had rain in it, and drawn up into the far corner of it. On a bed of old fleece somebody had pulled down through the same gap a long time ago were 4 wolves. They were not whelps. They were half-grown, long in the leg, all joint and ear, with the loose skin of animals that have got their frame before their flesh, and the biggest of them would have come to her knee. They were also, and she saw this before she saw anything else, starving. Not thin the way a lean animal is thin. Starving in the way that flattens the head and dulls the coat and turns the eyes into the only part of the face with any weight in it. 3 of them were the gray-brown of wet stone. The 4th was near black. They looked at her. Not one of them moved. Not one of them made a sound after that first broken whine. And that was the part that sat in her chest and stayed there for the rest of her life. That they had learned, in the dark, under a dead man's floor, that making a noise did not bring anything, and had stopped. "Oh," said Thyra. "Oh no," she went up the ladder of her own thinking very fast, and came down the other side of it with nothing. She had 3 days of meal. She had a little salt, a knife, a pot and no bow, and the nearest man who would help her was a man who would help her by going down to Hvitsand and telling the district there were 4 wolves in Otkel's cold house. And she knew exactly what the district would do about 4 wolves. They would come up in a body with the dogs. They would be pleasant about it. Nobody would be cruel. They would arrive and deal with the thing and go home before noon, and she would be thanked for reporting it. She lowered the flagstone back down until it left a hand's width of gap, which was what it had had before, because she was not fool enough to think she had discovered a secret. Then she went and got the last of the dried fish out of her basket, and the piece of hard cheese she had been saving, and she broke both up small and put them in her wooden bowl and pushed the bowl down through the gap on the flat of the rafter end and drew back. Nothing happened for a long time. Then there was a rustle in the dark, and one of the gray ones came out from under the fleece on its belly, an inch at a time, with its eyes on her and its ears flat. And it got its nose in the bowl and ate the way starving things eat, in a silent hurry, and the other 3 came after it, and in the time it takes to say a paternoster there was nothing in the bowl at all. Thyra sat on the stone bench in the cold house with her hands hanging between her knees, and worked out that she had just fed 4 animals with 3 days of her own food, and that she had done it without deciding to, and that this meant the decision had already been made somewhere lower down in her than the part of her she argued with. "Well," she said. That's that then. What followed was 8 days that she remembered afterwards as one single day, gone over and over, with the light going out of it at 3 in the afternoon and coming back at 10 in the morning and the wind never stopping. She fished the beck. She cut a hole through the ice above the pool with the back of the knife and a stone and lay on the bank in the snow and dropped a line she made out of her own thread doubled 4 times, with a bent nail for a hook, and after a day and a half of it she got a char the length of her forearm and cried again, briefly, out of relief, and gave 2/3 of it to the floor. She set snares along the birch scrub with wire she pulled out of the byre wall, and they took nothing for 3 days and then took a hare, and she gave nearly all of that away too, and licked her fingers afterwards, and was ashamed of herself for how good it tasted. Twice in those 8 days she went down to Hvitsand and worked a full day in Kettle's wool room, and did not tell anybody anything, and walked back up the valley in the dark with a half measure of meal and a lump of tallow, and her hands stinking of grease, and slept 4 hours, and got up. By the 5th day they came up out of the hollow when they heard her cross the yard. By the 7th they were waiting at the door of the cold house. By the 8th, the near black one, who was the boldest and the worst-mannered and the one she was going to have trouble with, put his forefeet on her knee while she was sitting on the bench, and she froze solid, and he put his nose in the hollow of her throat and breathed on her, and then took himself off with his tail going and sat down and looked at her as if she were the one who had done something remarkable. She named them on the 8th night. She had been holding off, because a thing with a name is a thing you have taken on, and she had a tithe of 4 silver a year on her and no roof over the south side. But it is not possible to feed something for 8 days and keep calling it, so she gave them plain working names off the hearth and the tool rack, the way you name a boat: Cole, who was the black one; Oska, who was the biggest and the quietest and had a smoke-gray ruff; Nogli, who was narrow and nervous and stood on people's feet; and Kvist, who was the smallest, a female, thin as a twig and last at everything, and who had a notch out of the top of her left ear that had healed long before Thyra ever saw her. There had been a 5th bed in the hollow. She had seen it the first morning and had understood it the way you understand a thing you would rather not, a deep-worn hollow in the fleece, much larger than the others, at the mouth of the den where a body would lie between whatever was in there and whatever came. It was cold, and it had been cold a long time. Whatever had carried 4 half-grown wolves up into an empty house and put them under a dry floor had gone out one day and had not come back. On the 9th day, a man came up the valley. She saw him a long way off, because there is nothing to see in Skarholt in the winter but the track, and she watched him come for the best part of half an hour, with her heart getting steadily worse. And she had the wolves shut in the cold house, and the flag over the gap, and a birch broom in her hands like a weapon before he was halfway. He came on foot. That was the first thing. Anybody with any standing at all in that district came up a valley on a horse, and he came up it on his own 2 legs through snow to the thigh with a bundle on his shoulder, and he came at the steady, thoughtless, forever pace of a man used to covering ground. He was enormous. That was the second thing, and it did not improve as he got closer. He was a head and a half taller than she was and built out through the shoulder like a door, in a plain, undyed sheepskin coat with the wool turned in. Rust-colored hair, dark red, going gray in one streak from the temple, worked into 2 thick braids. A beard the same, close cut at the jaw. A hard, heavy, weathered face that was not handsome and had given up expecting to be. Gray eyes. No rings on him, no brooch, no silver, no color anywhere on the man at all, which she noticed the way anyone notices an absence, without knowing yet that it was the whole story. He stopped in the yard at a distance that she understood. Later, he had chosen on purpose, and put his bundle down in the snow, and said, "Is there a holder here now?" "There is," said Thyra. He waited. Then he said, "Where is he?" "You're looking at her." Something happened behind the man's face. It was not surprise. Exactly, it was more like a man setting down one thing he had been carrying and picking up another. "Ah," he said. "Beg pardon. The roof's off the south side of the byre," said Thyra, "and the door's off the house, and I've a broom in my hands and nothing else. So if you've come up here to look at the ghost, you can look at it from where you're standing." To her considerable annoyance, the man laughed. It was one short breath out through the nose, over almost before it started, but it moved his whole face. "I've come up," he said, "because there's smoke on a house that's had none for 9 winters. And a house with smoke on it in the middle of the winter wants a roof. I'm a shake splitter. I'll do the byre and the house and hang your door for you, and I'll get the south side closed before the Frostmoon. I can't pay you." "No," he agreed, "I didn't think so. I mean it. I have nothing. I have a tithe on this holding of 4 silver a year, and I have half a bag of meal and a hair's worth of nothing. And there is no coin anywhere on this place, and none coming." "Meals," said the man, "such as they are, and a corner out of the wind. That's the whole of it." Thyra stood in the snow and looked at him for a long moment with her chin up, because she had been given things before by pleasant men, and every one of them had cost her more than the thing was worth. "Why?" she said. He looked at the mountain behind the house for a while, and then at the byre with its ribs showing, and then, briefly, at her. And what he said was true, and was also about 1/5 of the truth. "Because I've been walking since the autumn," he said, "and I'd like to be still for a bit and have work in my hands, and there's nowhere from here to the pass that isn't full of people talking. That's my reason, and it's a poor one, and you're entitled to send me off with it." "There'll be no talking here," said Thyra. "No," said the man. "I can see that." His name, he said, was Hal. She gave him hers, and he took it without any of the small movement people's faces made in Hvitsand when they heard Haldorsdottir, and she noticed that too, and put it away with the rest. He slept in the byre under the sound half of the roof for 7 weeks. He was up before she was, every day, which she would not have believed of anybody. He came back up from the birch and the pine at the foot of the valley with loads she could not have lifted off the ground, and set a block outside the byre and split shakes with a fro and a maul from first light to dark. And the sound of it went up and down Skarholt all day, talk, 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 so that she could tell by ear from inside the house whether the wood was running true. He put the south side of the byre roof on in 9 days. He hung her door. He drew the whole of the old hearth out, stone by stone, and laid it again dry, with a back stone canted the way they do it further north. And after that, the house drew properly and stopped filling with smoke at her eye level, and she stood in the middle of her own floor that evening and breathed clean air in her own home for the first time, and had to go outside for a minute. He ate what she gave him and never once looked at the bowl to measure it. He said perhaps 40 words a day. When she asked him a question, he answered it. Exactly. And then stopped. And there was no other man she had ever met who could do that. And on the 3rd day, he found out about the wolves. Because there is no keeping a thing like that from a man living in your byre. She had gone across at dusk with the pot, and coal came out at her legs the way he did, all elbow and enthusiasm, and knocked the pot out of her hands, and she said something in the dark that her mother would not have cared for, and when she straightened up with the pot, the man was standing at the corner of the cold house with an armful of shakes, watching 4 wolves come out of a dead man's floor to eat out of a woman's cookpot. Thyra put herself between him and them, which was, she knew even at the time, the single most ridiculous thing she had ever done. "They're mine," she said. "I can see that. They were here before I was. They're not strays and they're not vermin, and they've never been near a fold in their lives. And the first man who goes down that valley and says the word wolf in the hearing of Kettle Branson will have 4 of them dug out of the ground and finished before noon, and I will not have it. So say what you're going to say." The man set the shakes down against the wall, slowly, and crouched, and did not put a hand out, and did not make any of the noises men make at animals. He simply went down onto his heels at a distance, and stayed there, and after a while Aska walked over to him with her head low and her ears half back, and stood at the length of an arm, and breathed at him. He let her. He kept his hands on his knees where she could see them. Then he said, in the flattest voice imaginable, "Where's the mother?" "There isn't one. There's a bed in there that's been cold since before I came." "How long have they been in the ground?" "I don't know. Since before the first snow, by the state of them." "I've had them 12 days. And you've been feeding 4 wolves for 12 days, he said, on a beck and a bag of meal." "I've been managing." The man stood up. He looked at Hvitsand, the small one, last at the pot as always, and he looked for a long time, and Thyra, who was watching his face and not the wolf, saw something go across it that she could not read at all, something that was almost like a man being struck. "Bring the lamp," he said. "I want to look at that ear." She brought the lamp. He did not touch the small one. He only got down on his heels and held the light low and steady and let Hvitsand come to it, and Hvitsand came. Because Hvitsand came to anything that was not moving. He looked at the notch in the top of her left ear for the space of 10 breaths, and then at her hind feet. And then he sat back in the straw and put his hands over his face for a moment, like a man who has walked a long way and only just been told he is there. "What?" said Thyra. "That notch is not a fight," he said through his hands. "It's a mark. It goes in at 6 weeks with a hot iron the width of a barley corn, and it goes in the left ear, and it is put there by one man in the north, and he has put it in the ear of every whelp of one line for 11 years. He took his hands down, and she has the double claw on both hind feet. Look at her. They've all got it. 4 out of 4. I don't know what that means." "It means these are not wolves out of the ice field," said the man called Hal. "These are the Hringstad line. These are the kings." The cold house was very quiet. Outside, the wind came round the shoulder of Skarholt and went over the turf roof with a long sound like a hand drawn over cloth. "The Alpha King," said Thyra. "Yes, the Alpha King's wolves are under my floor. Yes, she sat down on the stone bench because her legs had stopped being interested in the conversation." Cole came and put his head on her knee, and she took hold of one of his ears without knowing she was doing it, and held on. "Then he'll come for them," she said. "He will, and I'll be." She stopped, and started again, and got it out flat. 12 days. I've had the king's line in a hole in my floor for 12 days, and I've told nobody. And I've a debt against my name and a holding that isn't paid for. And there's not a lawman between here and the sea who'd call that anything but theft. "That's about the shape of it," the man agreed, "if a man wanted it to be." Would he want it to be? Hal was a long time answering that. He got up and put the lamp on the bench and stood looking into the black slot where the flagstone was lifted. And when he spoke, his voice had gone somewhere further back in his chest. "The mother's name was Not," he said. "She was 9 years old and she was bonded. And last winter she went out onto the ice field above the pass in a bad week with the litter in her, and she did not come back. He had men out for her from the thaw to the leaf fall, 200 of them, and a silver piece to any man who brought word." He shook his head slowly. Nobody ever thought to look in a house with no roof. They looked in the wild. She didn't go to the wild. She got over the pass with 4 whelps at heel, 30 miles of it, and found the only dry floor in Skarholt, a floor with no man on it, no dog on it, no smoke on it, and put them under it, and went back out for food. and that is where it stops." "How do you know all that?" said Thyra. He turned around and looked at her, and for a moment, she thought about that moment for years afterward. She had the very clear sense of a man standing at the top of a stair, deciding whether to come down it. "Every shake splitter from here to the pass knows that story," he said. "It was in every hall in the north all summer. It was not a lie." It was simply not the answer to what she had asked, and she was too tired and too frightened to catch the difference, and by the time she caught it, months later, it did not matter anymore. "Then I'll send word down," she said. "Tomorrow I'll go down to Thorvald myself and say it plainly, before Kettle or anyone else says it for me, and they can come up and take them, and all." "No," said Hal. It was the first flat contradiction he had given her in 12 days, and it came out of him like a door shutting. "They're his," said Thyra. They were his. He came and stood over her, and there was nothing threatening in it at all, and she was frightened anyway, because there was suddenly a great deal of the man in the room. "Listen to me, and then do what you like, because it's your floor. A wolf out of that line does not belong to a man the way a sheep does. It goes to one hand and one hand only, and it goes when it chooses, and not before. And after it has chosen, you cannot give it away, or sell it, or carry it 30 miles in a cart to a stone yard full of strangers, because it will not eat there, and it will not sleep there, and in 3 months you will have nothing left to give back to anybody. That is the oldest law in the north, and there is not a king alive who can vote it down." He nodded at the 4 of them, at Cole with his head still on her knee, and Aska lying full length against her foot, and Nogli standing on the toe of her boot as he always did, and Vist just out of reach, watching. Those 4 came up out of the ground on the 5th day, for a woman who was giving them 2 parts of everything she had, and keeping 1. "Do you know what that is?" "They were hungry," said Thyra. "They were starving on the 1st day too, and they stayed down there. It is not hunger." He picked up the lamp. "It's done. It happened somewhere in the 2nd week, in the dark, while you were on your knees in the snow catching a fish for them with your own thread. Nobody sees it happen. You'll spend the rest of your life being told you must have arranged it." "I'm nobody," she said. "I'm a debt with hands on it. Hal, there are 6 houses on this water that have been waiting 4 years for the king to send down for a whelp of that line, and it's gone to me? Under a floor? In Skarholt?" "Yes," said Hal. "Why?" "Because," he said, "she was not putting them where a great man would find them. She was putting them where they would be warm and dry and out of the wind until somebody came who would feed them before herself." He went to the door with the lamp, and stopped in it, and did not turn around. She was always a better judge than I. And then he stopped that too, and finished, after a moment, than most, and went out. Kettle came up the valley 8 days later with 2 men and a sledge and the settled expression of a man performing a duty. He had brought her a bag of meal, a side of bacon, and a pair of felted boots, and he had brought them, he said, because Gunvor had not slept properly since the moot, and because whatever anybody said, family is family. He put them down in the yard. Then he looked at the new shakes on the byre, and the door hung true on its straps, and the smoke going up clean, and something in his face went slightly out of shape. "Who did this?" "A shake splitter," said Thyra. "He's working for his meals. There's no shake splitter on this water in the winter." Then it did itself. That was when Nogli came round the corner of the cold house. She had been afraid of that moment for 20 days, and when it came there was nothing whatever she could do about it. Nogli stood in the middle of her yard with his ears up and his ridiculous long legs, and looked at 3 strange men and a sledge, and one of Kettle's men said, "Sweet God," and took 2 steps back, and Kettle Branson went the color of a wet sail. Then his face changed, and Thyra, who had known him for 3 years and had learned him the way you learn weather, saw the exact moment the fright turned into arithmetic. "How many?" he said. 1. "Thyra, how many?" 4, she said. 4. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. 4 wolves. In a cold house. On a holding that's held on a stick and not paid for. And he began, very quietly, to laugh, and it was the worst sound she had heard in her life. "Oh, girl, oh, you poor stupid girl. Do you know what you've done? There's a silver piece ahead on a wolf on this water, and there has been since my father's time, and there's a house at Hvitsand that would pay 20 for a pelt of a good one to hang in a hall, and you have been keeping them. Feeding them on the king's own tithe land. They were here first." "They are strays," said Kettle, "and a stray goes to whoever claims it. And I am claiming them, and I'll thank you to stand out of my way, because I am not leaving 4 wolves in a valley 2 hours above my own children. You'll not touch them. I'll take them down and do it in front of Thorvald, and it will be lawful," said Kettle. "And then I will petition the moot to have this holding voided, and you will come home and sit at my table and be grateful, and in 6 years, when the 40 silver is worked off you, you may thank me." And then a man came round the byre with a maul in his hand. He did not raise it. He did not say anything at all. He walked out into the middle of the yard between Kettle and the cold house, put the head of the maul down in the snow, stood with both hands on the end of the haft, and looked at the 3 of them, and Thyra watched 3 grown men do the arithmetic all over again, faster this time. "This is my hire," she said into the silence. "Hal, this is my sister's husband." Said Hal. Kettle got himself together. He was not a coward. He was worse than a coward. He was a man who genuinely believed himself to be reasonable, and he stood in the yard of his wife's sister's ruined holding and pointed at her and said, "Then you'll answer for it at the winter moot, both of you," and got his men and his sledge and went down the valley, and left the meal and the bacon and the boots sitting in the snow. Because he was not a monster either, and that was somehow the hardest part of all. The summons came up 5 days later, cut on a strip of birch, carried by a lad who would not come past the gate. Thyra could not read it. She stood in the yard holding it in both hands with her ears roaring, and Hal took it out of her fingers and read it to her without ever once making it a thing that she could not read, which she noticed and stored, and could not have said why. She was to answer at the winter moot at Hvitsand, at the full of the Frostmoon, on 3 heads. That she had kept beasts of the king's own line without leave. That she had suffered waste on Titheland. And that, the holding being in arrears and the holder having no means, Kettle Branson petitioned that Skarholt be voided into the chest and the balance of 40 silver be worked off her body in bond service. 6 years, in his own house. "He wants me back," she said. "That's all this is. He wants me back at his table so the district stops looking at him." "I know," said Hal. "He isn't even wicked. That's the thing nobody will believe. He'll cry at his own hearth about it." "I know," said Hal. She went in and sat by the fire and did not speak for a long time, and he let her. And that was the great gift the man had. He could sit in a room with a person's silence and not put a single thing into it. The Frostmoon was 9 days off. She spent them teaching 4 wolves to come to a whistle. She did it because she had worked out, lying awake, that whatever happened at the moot they would be taken somewhere by somebody and she would not be there, and there ought at least to be one sound in the world that they knew. So she stood out on the home field in the blue afternoons with her fingers in her teeth and whistled 2 notes, low then high, over and over, until all 4 of them would come out of the birch scrub at a dead run from 200 paces and knock her down in the snow, and she would lie there laughing with wolves standing on her, and Hal would go on splitting shakes with his back to her, talk, talk, talk. And she never once caught him watching and always somehow knew that he had been. On the last night but one, she paid him off. She had thought about it for a week. A man living on a holding is named on the stick with its holder. That was the law. And Thorvald was a man who read the law all the way to the bottom. And if Hal was named, the 40 silver could be laid against him too. And a hired man with 1 coat and no land can be bonded as easily as a woman, more easily and for longer. So she got out the little that she had and put it on the board. A horn of the last salt, half a bag of meal, the folded sailcloth, and her mother's soapstone spindle whorl, which was the only thing on that holding worth a coin, and which had been on her mother's spindle and her grandmother's before that, and had a ring of pricked crosses round the hole where somebody had once tried to make it. Into something more than a stone. That's 7 weeks' work, she said. It isn't. It's nothing like it. But it's everything on this place that isn't the roof, and I want you gone before first light, and I want you a long way down the shore before anybody at that moot says your name. Hal looked at the board for a long moment. You'll want the salt, he said. I'll want you not on that stick. Girl, don't. Her voice came out badly, and she took a breath and got it back. Do you know what I have got? In the whole world, at the end of all this, I have 4 animals that are going to be taken off me on Thursday, and 1 man who did 7 weeks of work on a dead house for porridge. That is the entire list. And I am not. And here she stopped and put her hand flat on the board and finished it very quietly. I am not putting 40 silver on the only person in this district who has never once made me feel like a sum. The fire moved. Outside, the wind came over the roof, and the Frostmoon was up over the shoulder of Skaramar, and the whole valley was blue. The man picked up the spindle whorl and turned it over in his enormous scarred hand and put it in his shirt, and said, "Then, I'll take it, and thank you." He was gone before first light, and she did not hear him go, and the salt was still on the board. She walked down to Hvitsand at the full of the frost moon with 4 wolves loose at her heel. She had plaited cords for them and got as far as the gate before she dropped the cords in the snow. Because a cord on a bonded animal is only a way of making a public thing look tidy. And she had had 3 years of making other people's discomfort look tidy, and was finished with it. There were 200 people in the yard of the moot-hall, and they opened in front of her like water in front of a keel all the way to the door. Not one hand went out. Behind her a woman said, quite clearly, "God have mercy." And somebody else said, "That's Haldor's girl." Inside, the hall was packed to the roof posts. Thorvald sat at the board with the sticks in front of him, and old Ingeman the stick warden beside him with his knife and his spectacles of horn. Kettle stood at the front in his good blue coat with Gunvor behind him. And along the west wall stood 6 men in leather and grey wolf fur who belonged to no house on that water. And when the wolves came in at Thyra's heel, every one of them came off the wall as if a rope had been cut. "Hringstad," somebody breathed. "The court is set," said Thorvald, and got silence. "Thyra Haldorsdottir, you answer on 3 heads. Keeping beasts of the king's own line without leave, waste on tithe land." And a petition, laid by Kettle Branson, that Skarholt be voided into the chest, and the balance of your father's 40 silver be worked off you in bond service, 6 years, in his household. He laid his hands flat. "Bercy, you are the king's man here. Look at them and say what they are." The gray, bearded captain came out onto the floor and knelt in front of Aska, and Aska looked at Thyra before she would let him near her, which nobody missed. He turned the small one's ear over with 2 fingers, and when he stood his voice was not steady. "That is the barley corn mark, left ear, in at 6 weeks, and I have held the iron myself for 11 years. That is Not's last litter. We have hunted this water for them, from the thaw to the leaf fall, 200 men, and the king has not slept a whole night since." He turned. Where were they? "Under the cold house floor at Skarholt," said Thyra. "In a dry hollow on a bed of old fleece. Their mother carried them over the pass and put them there and went back out and never came in again. They were starving when I found them. I have had them 26 days. Under a floor, said Bercy, in a house with no roof on it. There's a roof on it now, said Thyra. Kettle stepped forward, because he could feel the room going somewhere he had not planned for it to go. She kept them. She knew what they were and said nothing. For 12 days by her own admission, with a debt on her name and no coin in the house. And any man here can work out what a woman in that case wants with 4 whelps out of a great line. She was holding them for a price. And what, said a voice from the back, did you offer for one? It came from beside the door, from a big man in a plain sheepskin coat with a bundle of shakes still on his shoulder and the snow not yet off him. Thyra shut her eyes. 20 silver, said the man. That was the figure in the yard at Skarholt on the day you came up with the meal and the boots. 20, for a pelt to hang in a hall. I was 6 paces off with a maul in my hand. Kettle's mouth opened and produced nothing. Who are you? Said Thorvald. Her hire. 7 weeks on the roof and the hearth. Then you have no standing, and you will hold your tongue. Unless you are speaking for her. Which brings us where we were going in any case. Thorvald turned the 3rd stick over. Before this hall may put a free woman into another man's house for 6 years, it asks once, and once only, whether anybody here will speak for her right in Skarholt. To speak is to stand liable with her. Your name goes on the stick beside hers and the arrears fall on you both. He looked up. So, who speaks for Thyra Haldorsdottir? Nobody spoke. It went on a long time. There is no being ready for a hall of 200 people you have known your whole life saying nothing at all. A bench creaked on the women's side and she knew without turning that it was Gunvor beginning to rise. And it creaked again as Kettle's hand came down on her arm, and after that Thyra could not feel her own face. Once more, said Thorvald, and then I record it. Who speaks for this woman? I will. He came up the middle of the floor with the shake still on his shoulder. No, said Thyra. She said it out loud, in front of all of them, and went at him and got a fistful of the sheepskin coat, which is a thing no woman does to a man in a moot-hall. No, Hal, don't. Your name goes on that stick. They'll lay the 40 on you. And you've 1 coat and a fro and nothing else in the world, and it's 8 years for a man. Not 6. Her voice went. You did my roof for porridge. You are not going into a house for me. He looked down at her with an expression she had never seen on him. I can't do that. Why not? Because I am not going to stand in a hall and watch this happen to you. And I have found out there is nothing in my life I can put in the way of it except my name, which is a poor thing, but it happens to be a heavy one. He set the shakes down on the boards. A speaker is named on the stick, said Thorvald, taking up his knife. Give your name for the record. Halvard Arneson. Nothing happened for the space of 2 breaths, because 200 people had all heard a name they knew perfectly well, and had each separately concluded they had misheard it. The only sound in the moot-hall at Hvitsand was old Ingemund, who was half-deaf and heard nothing all day but names, and who had already begun to cut, and whose knife stopped in the wood with a small dry click. Then Bercy went down on 1 knee, and his 6 men behind him, and the sound of it went through the hall like a wave breaking, and the district followed, in 1s and 2s and then all together. The whole packed room folding down onto the boards, until there was nobody standing in that hall but Thorvald, who was too old to kneel and too honest to pretend, and Kettle Branson, whose legs would not answer him, and Thyra Haldorsdottir, who still had a fistful of the king's coat in her hand. You, she said. Yes, 7 weeks. Yes, in my byre. On porridge. Yes, said Halvard Arneson, Alpha King of Hringstad. And I would take back 1 hour of it, and not the rest. And I will tell you which hour, but I am doing the other thing first. Because there are 4 wolves on this floor and a stick in that old man's hand with your name on it. He turned round. He did not raise his voice, she learned over the years that he almost never did. "Bercy, get up! All of you, up! I can't work with the floor like this." He waited out the long wrestle. You have been told a story this morning about a woman who hid the king's line in a hole for money. I am the king, they are my line, and I have been living in her byre since the first snow. He put 2 fingers in his mouth and whistled. 2 notes, low, then high. Her whistle. He had stood at that block with his back to her for 9 days and learned it off her. 4 wolves crossed the floor. They crossed it to Thyra. Oska got there first and sat square across the front of her boots. Facing the hall, Cole leaned his whole weight into the back of her knees so that she staggered. Nogli stood on her foot. And Hvitsand, the small one with the mark in her ear, came last, the whole length of the hall at a slow trot, and stopped in front of the king of Ringstad and looked up at him, and went past him, and pushed her head up under Thyra's hand. "There," said Halvard. "That is the case, and it took them 20 heartbeats. They are not hers because she took them. They are hers because they chose, in the dark, in the 2nd week, while she was catching fish through the ice with her own sewing thread and eating 1 part in 3. A wolf of that line goes to 1 hand. It cannot be given, or sold, or carried off in a cart to a stone yard, because it will not live there, and there is no king in the north who can vote that law down." He looked at Kettle. 20 silver. My lord, you will not be punished for it. Half the men in this hall have thought it, but you will hear it said once, you offered 20 silver for the pelt of the last thing my wolf did before the ice took her, and the woman you offered it to had been keeping it alive on a bag of meal. Kettle sat down on the bench like a sack. "Now the debt," said the king. "Thorvald, read it. It is written and it is plain. Halder Otterson of Hvitsand, 40 silver to the chest, the ice year, nothing paid. Died 3 winters back, and by the custom of this district an unpaid debt goes to the surviving household." Thorvald shrugged, not unkindly. "I have read that stick out at every winter moot for 11 years. "You have read the mark," said Halvard. "Read the stick. The reason mark on the back, and whatever is cut below it. Every debt stick in the north carries the cause on the reverse and the shares against it. That is how a lawman proves it was a debt, and not a robbery. And not you, Thorvald, with respect. You were not the lawman that year." He nodded at the old man in the horn spectacles. "Ingemund cut it. Ingemund, turn it over and read me what you cut." The stick warden took it in 2 spotted hands and held it close to his eyes, and the hall waited, and Thyra stood in the middle of the floor with a wolf against each leg and no idea at all what was about to happen to her. "Surety," read Ingemund, in the flat sing-song of a man reading a thing he cut with his own knife. "The ice year, the tithe of the Gullfjord being 40 silver, and the district being unable, and the seat being entitled to take the land of the unpaying in forfeit. Halldor Otterson stood surety for the whole, and paid it in 1 sum, borrowing the same off the chest against his own name, and his boat, and his winter stock. Shares to be repaid to him by the households benefiting. He turned the wood to the firelight. To wit, 14 households. Branson, Kettleson, Vigfusson, Orm of the outer shore." "Stop," said Thyra. Her voice did not sound like her own. Ingemund stopped. "Say the first part again." "Halldor Otterson stood surety for the whole and paid it in 1 sum." The hall had gone so quiet that the fire was the loudest thing in it. "It was never his," said Thyra, to the stick and not to any of them. "The ice year. I remember the ice year. There was nothing. And then there was something. And everybody said the seat had been merciful." She looked up along the benches, at the outer shore men and at the back of her sister's husband's blue coat. "It was not merciful. He paid it. My father paid the tithe of 14 households so that none of you lost your land, and he borrowed the 40 to do it. And he died with it on him, and you put it on me. And every one of you has sat in this hall for 11 years and heard that stick read with his name on it. and not one of you ever asked what the back of it said. Nobody answered. Old Randveig, on the women's bench, put both hands over her face. 3 men came out to the wool room for me. In 3 years, said Thyra. And every one of them was taken aside first and told there was 40 silver on me. And it was yours. Girl, said Thorvald heavily, I did not know. No, I believe you. And then, because she was her father's daughter and could not help it, why didn't he tell me? It was Randveig who answered, with her hands still up at her face. Because then you'd have had to sit in church every Sunday of your life, she said, and know which 14 of us it was. The king let that stand in the hall a while. He was good at that. Then, the chest will take the shares off the 14 households with 11 years on them at the spring moot, and Thorvald will see it done. And the 40 silver on Skarholt is discharged this hour. No, said Thyra. 200 people looked at her. Not discharged. Discharged is a favor. Discharged is you standing up and being good to me in front of everybody. And in 20 years, that is the whole story anybody remembers. The king was kind to the debt girl. She turned to the board. Ingemund, cut it paid. Paid by Halder Otterson in the ice here, which is what happened. And the shares owing to his household underneath. And read the back of that stick out loud in this hall every winter until you are too old to hold it. I don't want it forgiven. I want it written down right. The stick warden looked at his king, and his king looked at the roof beams a moment and said, not quite steadily, do exactly as she says. Afterwards, old Ingemund took her through the low door behind the board into the stick room, where 4 walls of shelving held every debt and dowry and boundary cut in that district since his grandfather's time. And he put her father's stick into her 2 hands and let her stand with it in the window light for as long as she wanted, and said nothing at all, which was the kindest thing anybody did for her that day. She got him outside eventually, into the blue light, with the Frostmoon coming up huge over the water and half the district pretending to be busy 40 paces off. 7 weeks, she said again. Ask it. Out here, not in there. Why? 3 reasons, and you'll like one of them. If I had given you my name on the first day, Bercy would have had a cart at your gate by dark and them in my yard within the week, and by spring I'd have had 4 dead wolves and a woman in Skarholt with a hole in her that never closed. That is the first, and it is true, and it is not why I stayed. Then why? For 7 weeks, said Halvard Arneson, nobody was afraid of me. He said it plainly, the way he said everything. I have been on that seat 11 years, and every man who has spoken to me in 11 years was weighing what I would do about it. Then, Not went out on the ice, and did not come back, and after that there was nothing in me at all. Not a thing. For a year. And then I split shakes for a woman who fed 4 wolves before she fed herself, and told me on the 8th day that if I put the block any nearer her door, she'd have it in the beck. That's 2. On that 8th day, standing in your doorway with an armful of wood, the thing in me that had been dark since not turned over, and woke. And it has been awake ever since. And it is looking at you now. He drew the cord out of his shirt, and on it, drilled through and worn where it had been every day since she gave it to him, hung her mother's soapstone spindle whorl. I could not say it in there. In there I am the seat, and you'd have had 200 people watching you answer. The line has chosen you in front of the whole district, and no alpha king in the north may take a mate the line has not chosen. So, for once in 11 years the law and I want the same thing. Thyra Haldorsdottir stood in the yard with 4 wolves sitting in the snow behind her, and 3 years of wool still under her fingernails. Ask me at Skarholt, she said. Not here. Here they all get to watch. At Skarholt there's a roof you put on and a hearth you laid, and a floor with a hollow under it. That's where it happened. That's where you can ask me. That is an hour and a half up a bad valley in the dark. Then you had better start walking, said Thyra. He asked her on the home field under the Frostmoon, with the mountains standing black behind the house and the beck talking under its lid of ice, and she said yes before he had finished. And then made him finish it anyway. They kept the holding, there was never any moving her off it. Ringstad had 11 halls, and she wanted the one with no roof on the south side. The tithe was paid every autumn out of her own hand. The stick was read at every winter moot with the back of it read first, and at the spring moot the 14 households paid their shares, some in silver, one of them in tears. Gunvor came up the valley in the summer with a basket and sat in the yard and cried and was let in. Aska whelped at Skarholt 2 years later, under the cold house floor, in the same dry hollow on a fresh bed of fleece. Because Thyra took the flagstone up herself and left it that way on purpose. And on winter nights, when the wind came round the shoulder of Skaramar and the frost moon lay blue across the home field, the Queen of Ringstad would stand out in her own doorway in a moss-green gown and whistle 2 notes into the dark, low then high. And 4 gray shapes would come out of the birch scrub at a dead run and knock her flat in the snow. And the biggest man in the north would come out to pick her up, and never once got there before the small one with the notch in her ear.